The clock on Officer Thompson's dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as he cruised through the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights. This was the kind of neighborhood where million-dollar homes sat behind perfectly manicured lawns, and every streetlight worked exactly as it should. After 15 years on the force, Thompson knew these streets like the back of his hand. He also knew that certain types of people didn't belong here this late at night. The black sedan caught his attention immediately. It was a nice car, probably, worth more than his annual salary, but something about it didn't sit right with him. The tinted windows were darker than usual, and the way it moved through the neighborhood seemed too careful, too deliberate. Thompson's instincts, honed by years of what he called street experience, told him this was worth investigating. He followed the sedan for 3 blocks, staying far enough back to avoid detection. The car made several turns, moving deeper into the residential area where the houses got even bigger and the lots even more private. Thompson reached for his radio and called for backup, just in case. You never knew what kind of situation you might be walking into. The sedan finally pulled into the driveway of a large colonial-style house with white columns and a circular drive. Thompson watched from across the street as the headlights went dark. This was his moment. He hit his emergency lights and pulled in behind the sedan, effectively blocking it from leaving. As Thompson stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively moved to rest on his service weapon, not drawing it, but making sure it was there if he needed it. The streetlight cast long shadows across the driveway, and the only sound was the gentle hum of his patrol car's engine. He approached the driver's side window with the confident stride of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Thompson tapped on the glass with his flashlight, the sound sharp in the quiet night air. Police, turn off your engine and step out of the vehicle. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a well-dressed black man who appeared to be in his 50s. He was wearing what looked like a military dress uniform with various ribbons and decorations across the chest. His hair was graying at the temples, and his posture suggested someone accustomed to command. "Good evening, officer," the man said in a calm, measured voice. "Is there a problem?" Thompson's jaw tightened. He didn't like the tone. Too confident. Too comfortable. This wasn't how these interactions usually went in his experience. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now. May I ask why you've stopped me?" "I live here." The man gestured toward the house they were parked in front of. Thompson felt his blood pressure rising. "Are you going to comply with my lawful order, or do we have a problem?" The driver took a deep breath, clearly weighing his options. Slowly, he opened the car door and stepped out. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of bearing that spoke of military training. Even in the dim light, Thompson could see more details of his uniform. This wasn't some rental costume. The ribbons, the insignia, everything looked authentic. "Sir, I'm returning home from a military ceremony," the man explained, keeping his hands visible at all sides. "I live at this address. If you'd like, I can show you my identification." "Don't move," Thompson ordered, his voice getting louder. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "As I mentioned, I live here. This is my home." Thompson looked around at the expensive houses surrounding them. Each one probably cost more than he'd make in a lifetime. The idea that this man lived here seemed impossible to him. Sure, the military uniform looked real, but anyone could get their hands on one of those. "You expect me to believe you live in a house like this?" Thompson gestured toward the colonial mansion. "In this neighborhood?" The man's expression remained calm, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of disappointment, maybe even sadness. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm asking you to treat me with the same respect you'd show any other resident of this community." "Respect?" Thompson scoffed. "You're driving around this neighborhood at midnight in a car with tinted windows. That's suspicious behavior in my book." "I was returning from a Veterans Day ceremony at the base. It ran late because we were honoring fallen soldiers. I have every right to drive through this neighborhood, especially since I live here." Thompson wasn't buying it. In his experience, people who lived in neighborhoods like this didn't look like the man standing in front of him. They drove different cars, wore different clothes, and definitely didn't get pulled over at midnight. "Let's see some identification then." Thompson demanded. "And keep your hands where I can see them." The man nodded slowly. "My wallet is in my inside jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it very carefully." "Do it slow." As the man reached into his jacket, Thompson's hand moved closer to his weapon. You could never be too careful. The streets had taught him that much. People weren't always what they seemed, and situations could go bad in a heartbeat. The man pulled out a leather wallet and opened it, removing several cards. "Here's my driver's license and my military ID." Thompson took the documents and shined his flashlight on them. The name read Colonel David Washington. The address matched the house they were standing in front of. The military ID showed the same photo and identified him as a full colonel in the United States Army. For a moment, Thompson felt a flicker of uncertainty, but he pushed it down. IDs could be faked. Uniforms could be borrowed. There had to be another explanation. "These could be fake," Thompson said, though his voice lacked some of its earlier conviction. Colonel Washington's eyes narrowed slightly. "Officer, I've served this country for 25 years. I've completed 3 combat tours and currently command a reserve unit. I'm asking you to check my credentials if you have any doubts." "Don't. Tell me how to do my job," Thompson snapped back, his defensiveness rising. "I've been patrolling these streets for 15 years. I know when something doesn't add up." The colonel took another deep breath, clearly working to maintain his composure. "What exactly doesn't add up? A military officer returning home after a ceremony?" Thompson looked around the neighborhood again. Every house was dark except for porch lights and security lamps. Normal people were asleep at this hour, not driving around in expensive cars. Something about this whole situation felt wrong to him, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "We'll see about that," Thompson muttered, pulling out his radio to run the license plate and ID numbers. As he waited for the dispatcher to respond, an uncomfortable silence settled over the scene. The colonel stood quietly beside his car, hands at his sides, while Thompson kept his distance and his hand near his weapon. Neither man knew that this encounter would change both their lives forever. The radio crackled to life, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the suburban driveway. Thompson held the device close to his ear, waiting for the dispatcher to confirm what he expected to hear. Fake IDs, stolen car, something that would validate his instincts about this whole situation. "Unit 47, we have your information," came the voice through the static. "License plate registered to David Washington at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. Clean record. Military ID checks out as well. Colonel David Washington, United States Army, currently commanding officer of the 342nd Reserve Unit stationed at Fort Morrison." Thompson's hand tightened around the radio. This wasn't what he'd expected to hear. He glanced back at the colonel, who was still standing calmly beside his sedan, waiting. "Run it again," Thompson said into the radio, his voice lower now. "Already double-checked, Officer Thompson. Everything's legitimate. Is there a problem?" Thompson released the radio button without responding. The dispatcher's words echoed in his head, but he couldn't quite process them. This man really was a colonel. He really did live in this house. The expensive car, the military uniform, the confident demeanor. It was all real. But instead of feeling relief or even embarrassment, Thompson felt something else entirely: anger, frustration, a sense that somehow he was being made to look foolish. "Well?" Colonel Washington asked quietly. "Are your questions answered?" Thompson's jaw clenched. "Just because the computer says something doesn't mean it's the whole story. I still want to know what you were really doing driving around this neighborhood so late." The colonel's eyebrows raised slightly. "I told you, I was returning from a Veterans Day ceremony. It's November 11th, in case you forgot. That was hours ago. What took so long?" Colonel Washington's patience was clearly being tested, but his military training kept his voice steady. "We held a special memorial for soldiers who died in Afghanistan last year. 3 of them were from my unit. We stayed late to honor their families and share memories. If you'd like, I can give you the contact information for the base commander who can verify my attendance." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Each answer the colonel gave made perfect sense, but admitting that would mean acknowledging that this entire stop had been based on nothing more than his own assumptions. Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Thompson said, his voice rising again. But I've been doing this job long enough to know when something's not right. What's not right? The colonel said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Is that you pulled me over for driving in my own neighborhood. What's not right is that you assumed I didn't belong here based on nothing more than the color of my skin. That's not what this is about, Thompson shot back quickly. This is about suspicious activity. Anyone driving around this neighborhood at midnight would get the same treatment. Would they? The colonel's question hung in the air like a challenge. When's the last time you pulled over a white person in this neighborhood for driving home late? Thompson felt heat rising in his cheeks. I don't see color when I do my job. I see suspicious behavior. Then why did you call for backup before you even approached my car? Why did you immediately order me out of the vehicle instead of simply asking for my license and registration? Why are you still questioning my right to be here even after confirming that I live here? The questions hit Thompson like physical blows. Because the truth was uncomfortable and he wasn't ready to face it. Instead, he doubled down. Because that's proper police procedure. Because I follow protocol. Colonel Washington slowly reached into his jacket pocket again, this time pulling out a cell phone. I'm going to record the rest of this conversation, Officer Thompson. I want there to be a clear record of what's happening here. Put that phone away, Thompson ordered, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon again. I have every right to record this interaction. It's legal in this state, and as a citizen, it's my right to document how I'm being treated by law enforcement. Thompson's mind raced. Body cameras, dash cameras, and now a citizen recording. Everything he did from this point forward would be captured and reviewed. The thought should have made him more careful, more professional. Instead, it made him more desperate to justify his actions. I said, put the phone away. You're interfering with a police investigation. Investigation of what? The colonel asked, holding the phone steady. You've confirmed my identity. Confirmed that I live here, confirmed that my car is registered to this address. What exactly are you investigating? The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Thompson's position. There was no investigation. There was no crime. There was nothing but a black man driving home in an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood, and a police officer who couldn't accept that such a thing was possible. I'm investigating suspicious activity, Thompson repeated. But the words sounded hollow even to him. Driving while black isn't suspicious activity, officer. It's just living. The phrase hit Thompson like a punch to the gut. He'd heard it before, usually dismissed it as liberal talking points or media exaggeration. But standing here in this driveway, faced with the calm dignity of a man he'd wrongly targeted, the phrase suddenly carried weight he'd never allowed himself to feel. That's not what this is, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then tell me what it is. Explain to me why a decorated military officer can't drive home without being treated like a criminal. Explain to me why my service to this country doesn't earn me the basic respect of being believed when I say I live in my own house. Thompson's radio crackled again. Unit 47, do you need that backup? ETA is about 5 minutes. The colonel's eyes never left Thompson's face. Do you need backup to handle one unarmed veteran standing in his own driveway? Thompson realized that everything was spiraling out of his control. What should have been a routine traffic stop was becoming something else entirely. The backup he'd called would arrive soon, and they'd see this situation for what it really was. His fellow officers would recognize Colonel Washington from community events, Veterans Day parades, and local ceremonies. The thought terrified him more than any dangerous criminal ever had. Cancel that backup, Thompson said into his radio, but his voice cracked slightly. You sure about that, Thompson? You called it in as suspicious activity. Thompson looked at the colonel, who was still recording, still waiting for an explanation that would never come, because there was no explanation that wouldn't expose the truth about why this stop had happened in the first place. Cancel the backup, he repeated, more firmly this time. But it was too late. In the distance, they could already hear the sound of sirens getting closer. Other officers were coming, and soon there would be witnesses to this encounter that had started with assumptions and was ending with the uncomfortable truth that some people got the benefit of the doubt, and others didn't. Colonel Washington lowered his phone slightly. Officer Thompson, I want you to understand something. I don't hate you for this, but I won't pretend it didn't happen either. This is exactly the kind of interaction that erodes trust between law enforcement and the communities you're supposed to serve. The sirens were getting louder now. Thompson realized that in just a few minutes, This private moment of reckoning would become very public indeed, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he began to understand that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. 2 patrol cars rounded the corner with their emergency lights flashing, casting red and blue shadows across the peaceful suburban street. Thompson watched them approach with growing dread. What had started as a simple traffic stop was about to become a very public spectacle. The first patrol car pulled up behind Thompson's vehicle, and Officer Rodriguez stepped out. She was a 10-year veteran who Thompson respected, known for her level-headed approach to difficult situations. The second car parked across the street, and Officers Chen and Williams emerged, both younger officers who looked up to Thompson as a mentor. "What's the situation?" Rodriguez asked as she approached, her hand resting casually on her belt but her eyes taking in the scene carefully. Thompson opened his mouth to explain, but before he could speak, Rodriguez's expression suddenly changed. Her eyes widened as she recognized the man standing beside the black sedan. "Colonel Washington?" she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Sir, I didn't expect to see you here." Colonel Washington nodded politely. "Good evening, Officer Rodriguez. I was just explaining to Officer Thompson that I live here and was returning home from the Veterans Day ceremony at the base." Rodriguez looked confused, glancing between Thompson and the colonel. "I'm sorry, sir. Was there some kind of misunderstanding?" Thompson felt his stomach drop. Of course Rodriguez knew him. Colonel Washington was probably one of the most respected military leaders in the community. He'd been featured in the local newspaper multiple times, spoke at high school graduations, and participated in every Veterans Day parade for the past 5 years. "You could say that," Colonel Washington replied diplomatically. Though his phone was still recording everything, Officers Chen and Williams had also recognized the colonel and were exchanging uncomfortable glances. Chen had actually met him at a community policing event just 6 months earlier, where Colonel Washington had spoken about building bridges between military families and local law enforcement. "Thompson," Rodriguez said quietly, pulling him aside. "What's going on here? Why did you call for backup?" Thompson felt trapped. Every answer he could give would only make the situation worse. How could he explain that he'd pulled over one of the most respected men in the community because he didn't believe someone who looked like him could live in this neighborhood? "I was investigating suspicious activity," he said weakly. "Suspicious activity?" Rodriguez repeated, looking back at Colonel Washington, who was standing calmly beside his own car in his own driveway, wearing a military dress uniform. "What kind of suspicious activity?" "He was driving through the neighborhood late at night." Rodriguez stared at Thompson as if he'd lost his mind. "He was driving home, after a Veterans Day ceremony. In uniform." She paused, and her voice took on a different tone. "Thompson, please tell me you didn't pull over Colonel Washington because you thought he didn't belong in this neighborhood." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Thompson could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, waiting for an answer that would either explain this situation or confirm their worst fears about what had really happened. It wasn't about that, Thompson insisted, but his voice lacked any conviction. Colonel Washington spoke up, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of military leadership. "Officers, I want to be clear about something. Officer Thompson has every right to investigate what he perceives as suspicious activity. However, I've provided my identification, confirmed that I live at this address, and explained why I was driving through the neighborhood. At this point, I'm unclear about what law I'm suspected of breaking." The colonel's words were measured and professional, but they highlighted the absurdity of the situation in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Here was a decorated military officer, standing in his own driveway being questioned by police for the crime of driving home. Officer Chen stepped forward hesitantly. "Colonel Washington, sir, I just want to apologize for any inconvenience. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." "I appreciate that, Officer Chen. But misunderstandings like this happen far too often, and they erode trust between law enforcement and the community. That's bad for everyone." Rodriguez turned back to Thompson, her expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Thompson, you need to explain to me right now what probable cause you had for this stop." Thompson felt cornered. Every police officer on the scene could see that there was no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, nothing that would justify what had happened. The only explanation was the one he couldn't bring himself to admit even to himself. "I saw a V." vehicle with tinted windows driving slowly through the neighborhood late at night. In my experience, that's often associated with criminal activity. Criminal activity? Colonel Washington's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. Officer Thompson, I need you to be very specific. What criminal activity did you suspect me of? The question exposed the hollowness of Thompson's justification. He hadn't suspected any specific crime. He'd simply seen a black man in an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood and assumed something was wrong. I was being cautious, Thompson said lamely. Cautious, the colonel repeated. Were you being cautious or were you making assumptions based on my race? The directness of the question silenced everyone. Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams all looked uncomfortable, but none of them came to Thompson's defense. Because they all knew the answer, even if Thompson wasn't ready to admit it. I don't profile people based on race, Thompson said, but the words sounded false even to him. Colonel Washington held up his phone, reminding everyone that everything was being recorded. Then help me understand, Officer Thompson. When's the last time you pulled over a white resident of this neighborhood for driving home late at night? When's the last time you demanded that a white person prove they belong in their own neighborhood? Thompson couldn't answer because there was no good answer. He'd never pulled over a white person under these circumstances. He'd never questioned whether a white person in a nice car belonged in a nice neighborhood. The pattern was obvious to everyone present. Rodriguez made a decision. Colonel Washington, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this incident. You're clearly free to go, and I'll be speaking with my supervisor about this situation immediately. I appreciate that, Officer Rodriguez, but I want to be clear that this isn't just about me. This is about a pattern of behavior that affects entire communities. I've served this country for 25 years. I command respect in military circles. I live in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. If this can happen to me, imagine what happens to people who don't have my advantages. The colonel's words carried weight that none of the officers could ignore. He wasn't just talking about one bad traffic stop. He was talking about systemic issues that affected how law enforcement interacted with entire communities. Sir, I understand your concerns, Rodriguez said carefully, and I want you to know that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. Colonel Washington nodded. I hope so. Because unless there are real consequences for this kind of behavior, it will continue to happen. And every time it happens, it damages the relationship between law enforcement and the communities you're sworn to protect. Thompson watched this exchange, feeling increasingly isolated. His fellow officers were clearly siding with the colonel, and he was being painted as the villain in a situation where he'd simply been doing his job. At least that's how he tried to justify it to himself. But deep down, in a place he wasn't ready to examine yet, Thompson was beginning to understand that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was a moment that would define his career, his reputation, and possibly his future. And as Colonel Washington finally got back into his car and drove the remaining 50 feet to his garage, Thompson realized that the real consequences of this encounter were just beginning. The next morning arrived like any other for Officer Thompson, but everything was about to change. He was pouring his second cup of coffee when his phone started buzzing with text messages from fellow officers. The first one made his blood run cold. Dude, you need to see the news now. Thompson grabbed the remote and flipped through channels until he found the local morning news. His heart sank as he saw the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Local police officer accused of racial profiling and traffic stop of decorated Army colonel. The news anchor, a professional woman with perfectly styled hair, was speaking directly into the camera. Good morning. We begin today with a developing story about a controversial traffic stop in the upscale Oakwood Heights neighborhood. Colonel David Washington, a 25-year veteran of the United States Army, was pulled over last night while returning home from a Veterans Day ceremony. Thompson's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the kitchen floor. On the screen, they were showing a photo of Colonel Washington in his dress uniform, medals gleaming across his chest. The contrast between this distinguished military leader and Thompson's assumptions from the night before was stark and humiliating. According to Colonel Washington, he was stopped by Officer Robert Thompson while driving to his own home after attending a memorial ceremony for fallen soldiers. The colonel recorded portions of the interaction on his cell phone, and that video has now been shared thousands of times on social media. Thompson's phone was ringing now. The caller ID showed his supervisor, Captain Richards. Thompson knew this call would change everything, but he couldn't bring himself to answer it. Instead, he watched in horror as the news report continued. We've obtained exclusive footage from the Colonel's phone recording. We want to warn viewers that while this footage doesn't contain explicit language, some may find the content disturbing. The video began playing, showing Thompson's aggressive approach to the traffic stop. Even watching it now, Thompson could see how unreasonable he'd been. The Colonel's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with Thompson's defensive hostility. Every assumption, every challenge to the Colonel's right to be in his own neighborhood was captured in crystal clear audio and video. Thompson's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, appeared on screen next. She was an elderly woman who'd lived in Thompson's neighborhood for 40 years. "I've known Bobby Thompson since he was a little boy," she said, shaking her head sadly. "I never thought I'd see something like this. That poor Colonel was just trying to get home and Bobby treated him like a criminal." The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time it was his partner, Detective Walsh. Thompson finally answered, dreading what he would hear. "Thompson, where are you?" Walsh's voice was tense. "Richards wants to see you immediately. And I mean immediately. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Get to the station now. How bad is it?" Thompson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Bad? Really bad. The video is everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. It's been shared by celebrities, politicians, military groups. The hashtag bobbing while driving is trending nationally." Thompson felt sick. Driving while black was a phrase he'd always dismissed as an exaggeration. But now it was being used to describe his actions in front of millions of people. "There's more," Walsh continued. "The local NAACP is calling for a press conference this afternoon. The American Legion issued a statement supporting Colonel Washington. And get this, the mayor's office has already been contacted by 3 different civil rights organizations." Thompson hung up and drove to the police station in a daze. The parking lot was full of news vans and reporters were setting up cameras for what looked like a major story. He used the back entrance hoping to avoid the media circus, but it was no use. Someone had leaked his photo, and within minutes of his arrival, his picture was being broadcast alongside the story. Captain Richards was waiting for him with Internal Affairs investigator Lieutenant Morrison and a union representative. The meeting was brief and to the point. Thompson was immediately placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. His badge and gun were confiscated, and he was told to have no contact with the media or anyone involved in the incident. "Thompson," Captain Richards said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I've known you for 15 years. I never thought I'd be sitting across from you having this conversation. What were you thinking?" Thompson wanted to explain, wanted to justify his actions, but every excuse sounded hollow in his own ears. "I was doing my job," was all he could manage. "Your job is to serve and protect all citizens equally," Lieutenant Morrison interjected. "Can you explain to me what law Colonel Washington was suspected of breaking?" Thompson stared at the table. He couldn't explain it because there was no explanation that didn't expose his own prejudices. Meanwhile, across town, Colonel Washington was facing his own difficult morning. His phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, military colleagues, and community leaders. The video had spread far beyond what he'd ever imagined when he decided to record the interaction. His wife, Patricia, brought him coffee as he sat in his home office, still wearing his robe. "The base commander called," she said softly. "He's proud of how you handled the situation, but he's concerned about the media attention." Colonel Washington nodded. "I never wanted this to become a national story. I just wanted there to be a record of what happened." "Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen," Patricia replied. "How many other people go through this without anyone ever knowing about it?" The colonel's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, who was a lawyer in Chicago. "Dad, I'm proud of you. Your dignity in that video is inspiring people. Don't let them make you the villain for standing up for yourself." But Colonel Washington wasn't thinking about being a hero or a villain. He was thinking about all the young black men who didn't have military rank, expensive cars, or houses in upscale neighborhoods to protect them from situations like this. He was thinking about his nephew, who'd been pulled over 6 times in the past 2 years for suspicious activity. He was thinking about the 17-year-old son of his sergeant, who was afraid to drive alone at night. By noon, The story had been picked up by national news outlets. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and major newspapers were all covering the incident. Social media was exploding with commentary from both sides. Some people defended Thompson, arguing that police officers had to make split-second decisions and couldn't be expected to recognize every resident of every neighborhood. Others saw the video as clear evidence of racial profiling and systemic bias in law enforcement. The police union issued a carefully worded statement supporting Thompson's right to due process while acknowledging the need for thorough investigation. The statement satisfied no one and only added fuel to the fire. Colonel Washington's military colleagues rallied around him. General Peterson, his former commanding officer, appeared on national television to vouch for the colonel's character and service record. "David Washington is one of the finest officers I've ever served with," the general said. "He's led men into combat, saved lives, and served his country with distinction for 25 years. The idea that he would be treated as a criminal for driving home from a ceremony honoring fallen soldiers is frankly disgusting." Thompson watched these interviews from his living room, feeling more isolated by the hour. His own department seemed to be distancing itself from him. His fellow officers were avoiding his calls, and his family was struggling to understand how their husband and father had become the center of a national controversy about race and policing. By evening, protest organizers were planning demonstrations outside the police station. Counter-protesters were organizing as well, creating the potential for confrontation. The mayor called for calm while promising a thorough investigation, but his words seemed inadequate to address the anger and frustration that the incident had unleashed. Thompson's 15-year career, his reputation, his future, everything was hanging in the balance. And somewhere in the growing storm of media coverage and public outrage, two men who had never met before last night were about to discover that their lives were now permanently intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. The real reckoning was still to come. 6 months after that fateful night in Oakwood Heights, Officer Robert Thompson sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in a community center conference room. Across from him sat Colonel David Washington, and between them sat Dr. Angela Foster, a mediator specializing in restorative justice processes. This was their 8th meeting, and Thompson still felt nervous every time. The investigation had concluded 3 months earlier. Thompson had been found guilty of racial profiling and excessive use of authority. He'd faced termination, but the police union had negotiated a different outcome: mandatory counseling, community service, sensitivity training, and participation in this restorative justice program. It was either accept these terms or lose his job and pension entirely. At first, Thompson had been resentful. He'd gone through the motions of counseling, completed his community service hours with barely concealed anger, and attended diversity training while internally arguing with every presentation. But slowly, very slowly, something had begun to change. "Robert," Dr. Foster said gently, "last week you mentioned that you'd started to see some patterns in your own behavior. Can you share what you've discovered?" Thompson shifted in his chair. These conversations never got easier, but they were getting more honest. "I've been thinking about other stops I've made over the years, situations where I maybe made assumptions." Colonel Washington listened without judgment as he had during all their previous meetings. His presence had been voluntary. He could have walked away from this process at any time. But something had compelled him to stay, to be part of whatever healing might be possible. "Can you give us an example?" Dr. Foster prompted. Thompson took a deep breath. "About 3 years ago, I stopped a young Hispanic man for suspicious behavior outside a grocery store. He was just waiting for his ride, but I assumed he was dealing drugs or looking to steal something. I made him empty his pockets, ran his ID, treated him like a criminal. Just like—" He paused, glancing at the colonel. "Just like I treated you. What do you think was different about how you would have handled that situation if the person waiting had been white?" Dr. Foster asked. "I probably wouldn't have stopped him at all," Thompson admitted quietly. "I would have assumed he had a legitimate reason to be there." Colonel Washington spoke for the first time that session. "That young man probably went home and told his family about being harassed by police for no reason. Maybe he was somebody's son, somebody's brother. Maybe he started to see all police officers as threats after that encounter." Thompson nodded, feeling the weight of understanding that had been building over months of these difficult conversations. I never thought about it that way before. I always figured if people weren't doing anything wrong, they wouldn't mind being questioned. But you were questioning whether they belonged, not whether they were doing anything wrong, the colonel pointed out gently. There's a difference. These insights hadn't come easily. Thompson's first few sessions had been defensive disasters. He'd argued, rationalized, and blamed everyone except himself. But Dr. Foster and Colonel Washington had been patient, allowing him the space to gradually confront truths he'd spent years avoiding. The turning point had come during their fourth meeting, when Colonel Washington had brought photos from his military service. Pictures of him leading troops in Afghanistan, presenting medals to fallen soldiers' families, speaking at military ceremonies. Thompson had realized that he'd almost destroyed the life and reputation of a genuine American hero, based on nothing more than his own prejudices. I keep thinking about my own son, Thompson said now. He's starting to drive soon. If he were pulled over, I'd want the officer to treat him with respect, to assume he belonged wherever he was. But I didn't give that same consideration to other people's sons. Colonel Washington leaned forward slightly. That's not an easy thing to admit, Robert. It takes courage to examine your own actions that honestly. Over the months, something unexpected had begun to develop between the two men. Not friendship exactly, but mutual respect. Thompson had come to understand the dignity and grace with which the colonel had handled their encounter, even while being treated unfairly. Colonel Washington had seen Thompson's genuine struggle to confront and change patterns of behavior that had been ingrained for years. Dr. Foster, the colonel said, I think Robert is ready to hear about the program we discussed. Dr. Foster smiled. Robert, Colonel Washington, and I have been talking about creating a training program for police officers. Something that goes beyond the standard diversity training. We want officers to hear directly from community members about how their actions affect people's lives. Thompson looked up with interest. What would my role be? We want you to share your story, Colonel Washington explained. Tell other officers about this process, about what you've learned, about how easy it is to let unconscious bias affect your professional judgment. The idea was both terrifying and appealing to Thompson. You'd want me to admit to other cops that I was wrong? That I racially profiled someone? We'd want you to help other officers avoid making the same mistakes, the colonel corrected. Your experience, as difficult as it's been, could prevent other incidents like ours. Thompson considered this. 6 months ago, he would have been mortified at the thought of publicly admitting his mistakes. Now he was beginning to see it as potentially the most important work he could do. There's something else, Dr. Foster added. The department has agreed to let you return to active duty, but in a new role. You'd be working in community outreach, building relationships between the police and neighborhoods that have had difficult relationships with law enforcement. Thompson felt tears welling up in his eyes. 6 months ago, he'd thought his career was over. Now he was being offered a chance not just to return to work, but to do work that might actually make a difference. Why? He asked, looking at Colonel Washington. After everything I put you through, why are you willing to help me? The colonel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because destroying your life wouldn't help anything. Because I believe people can change if they're willing to do the hard work. And because the best way to prevent future incidents is to have officers who truly understand the impact of their actions on the communities they serve. 3 months later, Thompson was back in uniform, but his job was completely different. He spent his days visiting schools, attending community meetings, and yes, speaking to groups of police officers about unconscious bias and community relations. The presentations were never easy. Some officers were skeptical. Others were openly hostile to the suggestion that they might need to examine their own behavior. But some listened. Some asked questions. Some shared their own stories of interactions they wished they could handle differently. Colonel Washington often appeared with him at these presentations, lending credibility and offering the perspective of someone who'd experienced racial profiling firsthand. Their partnership had become a model for other departments dealing with similar issues. The thing people don't understand, Thompson would tell audiences, is that I never considered myself racist. I had black friends, I worked with black officers, I thought I was treating everyone fairly. But when you dig deeper, when you really examine your actions and decisions, sometimes you discover patterns you never recognized. Colonel Washington would add, and the thing people don't understand about being on the receiving end is that it's not just about one bad interaction. It's about a lifetime of wondering whether you're being judged by your character or your skin color. It's about teaching your children to be extra careful, extra polite, extra respectful, just to stay safe. Their story didn't have a Hollywood ending where all problems were solved and everyone lived happily ever after. Racial bias in policing remained a systemic issue requiring ongoing attention. Not every officer who heard their presentation was convinced. Not every community member was ready to trust police officers again. But change had begun. In their own department, traffic stops involving minority citizens were now more carefully monitored. Officers received additional training on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Community meetings were held regularly to maintain dialogue between police and residents. Most importantly, two men who had started as adversaries had found a way to turn their painful encounter into something constructive. They'd proven that even the most difficult conversations could lead to understanding, growth, and positive change. Thompson never forgot the lesson he'd learned that night in Oakwood Heights, that assumptions based on race could destroy lives, careers, and community trust. But he'd also learned that acknowledgement, accountability, and authentic effort to change could begin to heal even the deepest wounds. Colonel Washington continued his military service while also becoming a powerful voice for police reform and community healing. He spoke at conferences, consulted with police departments, and mentored young officers who wanted to serve their communities with integrity. Their partnership became proof that redemption was possible, that people could change, and that even the most painful encounters could become opportunities for growth and understanding. If people were willing to do the difficult work of looking honestly at themselves and genuinely listening to others, the real victory wasn't in the media attention or the awards they eventually received. It was in the quiet moments when other officers made better choices, when other citizens were treated with dignity, and when communities began to heal the rifts that had divided them for far too long. It had all started with one traffic stop on a quiet suburban street. But it had become something much larger, a reminder that change was possible, one conversation and one honest encounter at a time.